And welcome to Chem Safety's series of online webinars. My name is Chrissy and I'm the Consultant Coordinator here at Chem Safety, and today we are looking at how to deal with emergency response spills and leaks. There is a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen where you can post questions. If you like one of the questions already posted, you can click on the upvote button. The more voting it gets, the higher up the list it goes, and the more likely to be answered during the session it will be. Any unanswered questions will be added to the follow-up email you will receive that will also include a link to the recording of today's session. Janet Konecki is presenting our webinar today. Not only is she a compliance certifier, she's also a senior consultant and a director of Chem Safety with over 18 years experience. As a recognised expert in the field of hazardous substance, Janet has been invited to speak and chair at numerous conferences and professional development sessions. I will now hand over to Janet.
Thanks, Chrissy. As I said, welcome to the webinar on managing our spills and leaks. I'll just get this screen shared. It will go there. And so what we'll be looking at today is how to deal with our spills and leaks. And as Chrissy said, please do make use of our Q&A function. So let's get started. One of the key aims of our emergency planning is to make sure that at any stage if an emergency does happen, that it's not a panic, that everything is under control, that the substance can't get too far, people know what they need to do, and the equipment that is needed is available. Today we'll be looking at why we need to do this, and this should be fairly straightforward. It's about safety, it's about cost, it's about lost time, it's about environment, and it's about the law as well. These are all very straightforward reasons as to why we need to deal with our spills and leaks. We'll be looking at some sources of information and personnel and equipment that we will need, the procedures that you would follow and identifying some of the hazards involved, and also testing our procedures, making sure that we do know what we're going to do when it happens. So we'll start with the regulations. We'll get these out of the way pretty quickly, and I'm only looking at the health and safety regulations here. The Environmental and Resource Management Act may also influence you on how you have to deal with your potential spills. So in the hazardous substance regulations, subpart 2 deals with emergency response plans, which include dealing with spills and leaks. There are relatively high thresholds for these, but that doesn't mean that if you don't exceed the threshold, you don't need to plan. Regulation 3.2 is one of those regulations that tends to get looked over, but it has a very broad duty associated with it. So the PCBU must manage the risks associated with their hazardous substances with either using, handling, manufacturing, or storage of them. There's no threshold for these, so it's a very broad, very general, you need to manage the risks associated with your hazardous substances. There are also specific requirements in the regulations for managing spills of Class 5 oxidizers, Class 6 toxics, and Class 8 corrosives. So if you do have those substances on site, there are some specific regulations there. Aside from the hazardous substance regulations, the GRIM regulations, the General Risk and Workplace Management regs also require that PCBUs have emergency plans. So even if you didn't have hazardous substances on site, you're still required to have emergency plans, and that would include dealing with potential spills and leaks. Even if substances are not necessarily hazardous, they can still pose risks from other areas such as slips. But what the regulations say is really a bit irrelevant. You do need to make sure you comply with them, but no matter what the scale of a spill, it will need to get cleaned up eventually. So we need to plan. You might not consider every spill and leak that occurs at your site to be an emergency, but in all cases, managing the spills and leaks very much comes under the classic PDCA cycle: the plan, the do, the check, the act, and repeat. So we need to plan, we need to identify our risks, what substances you have, how much could spill, how bad is it going to be if it does occur. We need to implement our plan, do some training, make sure we've got the equipment and the procedures available, and then we need to check it. We need to practice and question the plan. If something occurs, we will actually act on it, and then after that we need to refine the plan, make sure everything's working and put it back into place. So we'll start with our planning stage and looking at some of the sources of information available to you. And so I've got a wee poll to start with. Seem to have a wee technical difficulty there, so we'll just pass on that. It's not coming up. So the questions I was going to ask you is, what sources of information do you currently rely on to manage a spill? And so perhaps I'll go through a wee list of them, and if there are any additional resources that you use, can you pop them into the chat and we can have a wee talk about them. So with the emergency response, some of the sources of information include emergency response plans, safety data sheets, looking at your product label. Bob, you've got Bob in the corner. Bob knows what to do. You might have the instructions in your spill kit. You'll have information from your supplier, SOPs or work instructions, and you may have displayed notices. Are there any other sources of information that any of you would rely on when you are looking at preparing for your spills? I'll just give you a wee chance to add something in there. All right, let's have a look in more detail about some of these resources that we can use. Emergency response plans, what people tend to think of when they're dealing with information for spills and leaks. One of the most basic but also the most useful emergency response plans are flip charts. Depending on the nature of your site, it might be your only plan. But if you have a more complex site, then you may indeed have a very detailed emergency response plan. But having a flip chart supplement for quick reference can also be very useful, so that everyone's got access to basic immediate information. The flip chart that I've got shown here is one that's been produced by WorkSafe, and there have been many iterations over the years from IRMA and EPA and WorkSafe. There's an electronic copy of this available at the Hazardous Substances Toolbox website. That's hazardousSubstances.govt.nz, and hard copies have been published in conjunction with HSPNZ. So that's the Hazardous Substance Professionals of New Zealand, a professional body for people working with hazardous substances. And Kim Safety does have hard copies of the flip charts available for purchase. WorkSafe no longer provide them as part of the printed toolbox that they did a few years ago. Your next key source of information will be safety data sheets, and you are required to have compliance safety data sheets for all of your hazardous substances on site there. One of our earlier webinars did cover safety data sheets. Section 6, it's one of my very favourite oh no sections. There's the oh no I've spilled it, oh no it's on fire, and oh no I've drunk it, my favourite sections of safety data sheets. And they detail the accidental release measures. And we can have a wee look at this example here. It gives us information such that it is a flammable liquid, so that there is the potential for explosive vapours that we'll need to make sure we keep the ignition sources away. And that includes making sure that you've got non-sparking response equipment. And so the common example of that would be if you've got a pile of absorbent material, such as kitty litter, you empty that over the spill, you need to then collect that up for disposal. So you get your shovel, and a metal shovel on a concrete surface can generate sparks, the very last thing we want around a flammable liquid area. It gives us some information about the absorbent materials that we should use. So in this case, looking at sand or earth or an inert material, and talks about making sure it's not going to be flushed away with water. So it's not something that's miscible and readily diluted. We do need to make sure we're collecting it and disposing of it suitably. It also references the sections of the safety data sheet on first aid. So if someone is exposed to vapours or comes in contact with the substance, that's where we look for information on dealing with that. And also the section on stability and reactivity. And so this includes telling us what other substances or materials this product could react with. And when dealing with spills, we often look at what happens if this substance spills, but you may also need to consider what happens if these 2 or 3 substances spill together and react, or if the substance spills and then it comes into contact with something that is incompatible. And we'll hear quite a bit today about oxidizers and making sure that organic materials, such as timber and paper and that sort of thing, don't come into contact with them. This safety data sheet is also separating our small spills from accidental release and major spills for our emergency procedures. The assessment of whether or not a spill is small needs to be part of your site-specific planning. You need to take into account the quantities that you have, how it is stored or used, and the response that you're able to provide. And that will help determine whether or not something is small enough for you to deal with yourself or larger that you need external support. So in one case, a manufacturing plant that I've come across were absolutely fully confident that they could deal with a 200-litre drum of toluene as a minor spill. They had the resources on site to manage that. It was something that would be part of nothing that would cause major concern for them. Whereas other sites do designate any spill of a flammable liquid above 5 litres as major. When dealing with highly toxic substances, especially gases, even a small quantity lost can be a major event. One of our sources of information will be your suppliers. So both your suppliers of hazardous substances and also your suppliers of spill response equipment. They'll have a great deal of resource and expertise available to you. So do talk to them. The people who supply your substances, they might offer services such as an emergency response service or support material to giving guidance on how to use the substances, including how to deal with spills. And they might have a load of experience on how other users of those substances deal with them. Your emergency response equipment suppliers, people who provide you with your spill kits and other equipment, often have great resource sheets and information about the capacity that you should have, what particular types of equipment and sorbents will be suitable for you. So do absolutely make use of your suppliers as a resource. They're always happy to help. Some of the other sources of information mentioned there. We'll have a look at spill kits instructions later in this session. But let's talk about Bob. A lot of sites will have a Bob. Bob is great. He knows everything. You've got experienced people on your site who know how to deal with things. The trouble is that Bob's not there all the time. For some reason, we let him go home at the end of the shift. He gets weekends and holidays. So if you've got a Bob or a team of Bobs, you need to extract and share their valuable knowledge and experience so that Kate and Percy know what to do. And more importantly, that Edmund can get it all written down into the cunning spill response plan so that even Baldrick can learn what to do. And my Baldrick analogy got a bit, Blackadder analogy got a bit out of hand there, but it gives a good picture of getting that information shared and written down so that it can be passed on and built on, and that you're not reliant on the knowledge that is sitting inside someone's brain. Having information in your day-to-day standard operating procedures or work instructions for what to do about some of the more likely scenarios means that people's response to those situations is a bit more front of mind, knowing exactly what they do need to do if something minor happens. With displayed notices, they can be more useful for things like drain covers, where the drains are, where the drain covers are, where the shut-off valves are, having that information front and centre on site at those physical locations so people know exactly what to look for and what to do in some of those immediate steps to stop further environmental loss of the substance. We'll have a chat now about our personnel. We've talked about Bob, but who else is going to help respond to our spills? Your very first line of defence is making sure that you've got trained staff. So they'll be there in most cases when the incident occurs, and they will get things going. To get an idea of who else will be involved in our spill response, whether it's an emergency or not, we'll have a look at one of the flip charts, and it will give us a really good idea of where to start. So, as I said, we've got our trained workers, and then we can look at our company contacts. So, depending on the size of your organisation, it might be a case that you've got one person who is the owner, the supervisor, the safety officer, and the spill coordinator. Those roles all have different purposes. In larger organisations, you may have a dedicated emergency response team who will come and help deal with the situation. Next, we have our emergency contacts, and depending on the incident that's occurred, you may need one or more of these. So looking there, we've got Fire and Emergency New Zealand and Ambulance and Hospital and Poison Centre, as well as the Regional Council and their pollution helpline. It's always important to know what reaction, what support, what resource these people are able to provide you when they do come to site. So in your emergency procedures, when you're looking at things and saying contact FENS, you need to know what they're actually going to do when they come to site, what can they do, what can't they do, and that's where the role or the requirement to submit your emergency response plan, if you're over the threshold in the regulations, to FENS for review comes in, so they can advise you whether or not your expectations of them are reasonable and within their resource. Similarly, finding out what sort of response your local or regional council can do will be valuable, whether they're able to come and help manage it or if they're more there from a regulatory point of view. Speaking of help, having contact details for your neighbours. So you might need to alert them of the incident that's occurred, but they might be able to help as well. You'll need, of course, to discuss this with them beforehand and know exactly who and what resource is available from them. But having that coordination with your neighbours can absolutely be invaluable in dealing with incidents on your site there. And lastly there, we've got our contractors and suppliers. Who's going to help with your waste disposal, your cleanup, and other services that you might need to respond and get back to normal. So we've got people who know what to do and who can help us. We're going to need some equipment. Things don't just look after themselves, unfortunately. So what sort of equipment will we need? Of course, there'll be spill kits. But before we get to those, we'll just have a look at some of the other types of resources that we might want to have on hand. So we need to consider both ends of the spill scale. So we often concentrate on what happens if there's a big spill, but making sure that you've got suitable resources at hand for dealing with small spills at the location. So if people are working where there's a chance that they can spill things, making sure that you have got suitable response equipment or paper towels or sorbent pads readily available just means that it can be dealt with almost straight away with no fuss at all. As an aside, who knew that there was such a thing as videos of sulfuric acid reacting on toilet paper? So paper towels are good for some things, but certainly if you've got concentrated acids or oxidizers, they're going to make things worse and a horrible fumy black gooey mess. For reactive or toxic materials, you may need specific neutralizing or decontamination materials, and that's part of some of those additional requirements in the regulations for toxics and corrosives. You need to make sure that you've got something suitable to contain your spilled material, the contaminated absorbents, any contaminated equipment, so you can contain that for disposal and be able to label it so that we're not presenting an unknown hazard risk by leaving unlabeled materials around. So these might include overdrums, so that if you've got a damaged or leaking drum, that whole thing can be lifted into a container for later disposal, or heavy duty bags or other suitable material for collecting and containing our contaminated waste. At the outset of today's session, I said our goal is to not panic. And for this to be effective, we need to have time. And having good, effective secondary containment or bunding provides you with time. It gives you the confidence that if something is leaking, it's only going to go so far, it's contained, it's not going to generate additional risk. We can stop and think and plan our response. So there's requirements in the regulations that if you are over the threshold that you need secondary containment, but the benefit of secondary containment is presented at all scales. So having small trays or bins for your smaller containers means that any leak that you might occur or any small spillage is still contained at that point. It's nice and tidy. It's not a threat. It's not a panic situation. You will need PPE, and you'll very likely need to consider both a higher degree of protection than you would have for your normal day-to-day operations, and you may also need to have additional PPE for extra people who come in to help. You'll need to check that everyone is trained in the use of this PPE. If there's any respiratory protection that's provided, has it been fitted to the people who will be wearing it? Is the filter cartridges, any other equipment within their use-by dates? And is it clean? I've seen some pretty grubby PPE set aside for emergency use, and it just doesn't get looked at very often. And so you get goggles and that sort of thing that you just don't want to put on your face. So making sure that you've got checks of your equipment, that it's all present and in good condition, and that it's going to be functional. If the spill can head towards a stormwater drain, are there drain covers or shut-offs in place? Are you going to need barriers to keep people away from a spill? So these are some of the other equipment that you might need to think about. But definitely spill kits. And it's important that you know what's in your spill kit and how to use it. So a typical spill kit will contain a range of absorbent materials. So absorbent pads are great for dealing with spills on flat surfaces, absorbent socks for surrounding the spill and containing it and preventing it from spreading further, helping to divert it away from any drains or areas that you want to isolate it from on site. Absorbent pillows can be useful for plugging into openings or gaps or placing in and around machinery that might be leaking. There is loose absorbent, which is great for absorbing liquids on rough or uneven surfaces, and make sure that there's a brush and pan or something similar so that you can collect it up again effectively. I'll talk more about the types of absorbent shortly. They will usually have PPE and also hazardous waste bags and instructions. Most spill kits that you get will have step-by-step instructions in there. And if we've got our time with our secondary containment or other provisions on site, then we've got a chance to stop and just check those instructions again as we go through in our response. Bigger spill kits might include things like drain protectors, leak putty, brooms, shovels, absorbent socks and things to pop into drains to prevent stray contaminants going down, additional PPE, hard hats, footwear, overalls, chemical suits. The range is almost endless there, so you may need to consider what's going to be suitable for your site. With sorbent types, it's really important to choose the correct sorbent material. An incorrect one could be ineffective, or it could react and make the situation worse. And we'll see an example of this in the case study coming up. Oil-only sorbent materials are really useful in that they can be used outside, and so will absorb any hydrocarbons, oils that have spilled, but not any surface rainwater that might be around. Don't fall into the trap, though, of just popping a sorbent pad underneath an oil container that might drip occasionally, and just leave it sitting out there for weeks on end, because that oil will release from that over time. The suppliers of your spill equipment will publish, will have resources and information available to you on what sort to go with which substance. So universal absorbent materials are good for oil and water-based substances, and then the aggressive ones, which are usually yellow, are for your really concentrated materials, your aggressive substances, your oxidizers, those sorts of things. And on the screen there, we've just got an example of part of a compatibility guide that Control Coal have on their website for people looking at their products. With the loose sorbent material, they're often from a variety of materials, usually in two categories, so mineral or organic. So with minerals, they're typically inert. You've got things like zeolite or mineral sponge, what typically used to be called kitty litter, but the kitty litter market has expanded greatly over time there, so there's a lot more available there. Sand, vermiculite, other materials on site for mineral there, but there are some substances that aren't suitable for mineral absorbents. So hydrofluoric acid is an example, and it reacts with silicon, such as you would find in vermiculite or sand, and it produces a toxic gas. And that information will be found on your safety data sheet. So when you're looking at making sure you've got the right material available, looking at the information on the safety data sheet in that section on accidental release measures or compatibilities will tell you what you can or what you shouldn't use for those. With organic materials, you might have things that are based on cellulose fibres or peat or a pile of sawdust, that sort of thing, and be very aware that these can react with oxidizers and strong acids to produce fumes and create a greater hazard. You'll also find specialised spill kits on the market for things like biohazards, little laboratory kits, dealing with mercury, which is a whole other kettle of fish. If you've ever had to deal with a mercury spill, you'll know how far the little beads can actually travel and fast they are. It's great to watch, pity it's so poisonous, and in medical situations like cytotoxics. And just specifics for the substances that you have. If you've got a large quantity of a substance, do check to see if there's something specialised that you should be using. So we're going to have a look at a case study next. And this is an incident from about 10 years ago, and it demonstrates a number of the things that we have been discussing. So what happened is that there was an incident occurred at site when a forklift pierced a 1,000 litre IBC of hydrogen peroxide. So this is a substance that is an oxidizer and it's corrosive. Some was spilled inside the factory, and then more was also spilled outside where the IBC was taken to help deal with the incident that occurred. The staff on site were trained and equipped to deal with the spill, and it's my understanding that a suitable spill kit was available and used at the site of the initial spill. Where things started to go a bit wrong is that additional equipment was obtained from elsewhere on site, and there was an organic absorbent material in those additional spill kits that was used on the spill, which reacted with the hydrogen peroxide, generating fumes. And at this point, emergency services were called because the incident had escalated beyond the capability of the on-site staff. So up until that point, they were perfectly competent and experienced and trained to deal with the spill that had occurred. So the reports say that around up to 40 firefighters were present for most of the day to help clean that up. So that's quite a bit of resource there. And the fire crews themselves needed to seek further expert help on just making sure that they were dealing with the hazardous substance correctly. Fire crews don't know everything about every substance, but FENS do have hazardous substance specialists to help. The news reports of the day were greatly concerned with the traffic disruption, as it was on a main Hamilton road, cut down the number of lanes available and caused large delays there. And the site did have its own facilities, and so it was able to dispose of the neutralised waste on site. It had processes that could deal with that. So they didn't necessarily have to worry about how they would store and dispose of the contaminated waste or the collected material afterwards. So we can see that even the most well-prepared facility can still be subject to a spanner in the work, which changes everything. They had everything in place, but one thing going wrong meant that the situation escalated from something that was within their control to something that needed emergency response support. I'm going to have a look now at the spill response process, and it's pretty universal, the basic spill response process. Different procedures and plans might have a slightly different order or more steps to them, but step one has always got to be safety. Make sure of your own safety and the safety of others. We need to identify what we're dealing with. If you've got good steps in place to know what substances are where, you've got good labels, you know what happens where on site, you keep things where they belong, you don't have stray things in the wrong place where people might have a situation that something spilled and they don't know what it is. Unlabelled containers are just a real liability on site. We need to contain what we've got, we need to stop it from getting worse. Things like, if you've got a leaking drum, can you rotate it or turn it upright so it's not going to drop anymore? Are there emergency stops and valves that you need to activate? Getting in some barriers and some socks around there. We need to clean up, absorb and decontaminate. We need to debrief about what happened, and then we need to get ready to go again with restocking equipment, updating our procedures and further training. And so I'm going to show you now a couple of examples of spill response instructions that have come from different suppliers, and we'll just have a look at two of them and see the differences between them. Well, not so much the differences, but just that they are presented slightly differently, and getting information from different sources can help activate different thought processes in your planning. So in this one here, we've got our step one, looking at assessment and assistance, making sure that our safety is not compromised, that we're helping injured people. We are clearing unrequired people from the area. So when we're considering what the hazards are in a spill response, people who are not helping get in the way and cause either interference, or they just cause a distraction for people who are responding with it. We need to make sure that we've assessed our capability to manage the spill, so that includes identifying what it is, what the quantity is it something that we've planned for, and reporting the incident so that you can get further assistance. We need to make sure that we've got our own personal protection in place, that we are consulting the safety data sheets, so making sure that the information from the safety data sheets is readily available to people who are dealing with the substance. Making sure that our PPE is appropriate and properly fitted before leaping in to help. We need to contain it, if we can do it at the source, make sure that we are preventing any stormwater drains from being impacted there. Then we are absorbing our spill, making sure that it is suitable for use with that material. So again, if we're not panicking, we've got that time to stop and think, is this suitable? One of the ways to prevent unsuitable things from being used is, if possible, only have the equipment that's suitable for the substance on site. You might have a variety of substances, so you would have different materials for different substances. People need to know clearly which ones can't be used for a particular substance. We've got some useful information about how to actually work in and clean up the spill, and again, how you decontaminate will depend on the substance as well. That should be identified in your broader plan as to what is needed for specific substances. Making sure that we've got our products disposed of with a reputable waste collection provider. And then we are looking at our debrief and our conclusion, making sure that it is reported and reviewed so that we can make changes if needed to the procedures, to the equipment, to our training, and then making sure that everything is restocked and ready to go again should something occur next week or the next day or next year. Again, this is a very similar thing. It's asking different questions in different places, but the steps, there's a few more of them, but it's about the same process. We're prepared, we're safe, we've stopped the source, we've protected our stormwater, we've notified the relevant people, we're cleaning it all up, we're disposing of it, and then we're restocking and reviewing the process. So a few more things to talk about when assessing the spill. Is it flammable? We do need to deal with any potential sources of ignition. I mentioned that earlier. People need to understand how flammable gases and vapours move in various conditions. So in most situations, if you've got flammable gases or vapours present, they're likely to be heavier than air. And so if it's calm conditions, they can pull and travel quite a long distance. But if you've got gases that are lighter than air, that's a particular hazard that you do need to be aware of. How are you going to communicate with people if it's not safe to have electronic devices in the area there? Is it a dangerously large volume? How can you contain it? If you've got such a volume on site that it's that large, then you should have secondary containment. Hopefully the spill has occurred within that secondary containment and not elsewhere on site during filling or transfer or movement of materials. If it is heading to the stormwater or waterways, again, your people need to understand which drains go where, what the topography is like. Are there intercept points? If you've got a number of drains on site that go to a sump or an interceptor, then that's not as much of a priority as one that goes straight to stormwater or out to a waterway. So knowing what those ones are and how to cut them off, how to protect them is essential there. If you're dealing with toxic or flammable gases, have you got a way of determining whether or not it's safe or unsafe? If you've got an ammonia plant on site, for example, have you got ammonia detection systems in place? Have you got personal meters so that people can be alerted if they are entering somewhere that it is potentially a toxic environment there? Are you assuming that in that situation that the FENS will have that equipment for them? Have you confirmed that with them? Can you tell which way the wind is blowing? Do you have a windsock? Is it fully functional? It's not a wee rag that's somehow become fixed. If your primary evacuation point is downwind, how are you going to alert people to use the alternative evacuation point? And if you're dealing with toxic gases such as chlorine, again, make sure you know exactly what you can or are able to do and what you can't do, what could make it worse, and what FENS will do. Depending on your situation and the availability time-wise of your emergency response, you will have a different plan. If you are in a more rural area or somewhere where there's a volunteer brigade, then a lot more of that responsibility for response comes onto you than if you were in an urban area where there is also a public safety risk involved. What would happen if the spill occurs as part of a larger situation, for example, in an earthquake? What if your external resources aren't available because they're tied up somewhere else? What is it that you're going to do to make sure that your immediate safety is still dealt with. The spill is still there, even if you've got other things to deal with. This becomes more of a triage situation in dealing with what the greatest threat is, but it will still need to be dealt with sooner or later, and having some backup plans may be required there. And has more than one thing spilled? Do you have reactions occurring? Have you got additional heat or toxic fumes being generated? Could your spill get into contact with another substance? Is it isolated? Are there other containers within the secondary containment compound that could be damaged if there's a spill of a corrosive material, for example, in there? These are some of the things that we need to consider when we are assessing our spill and planning for it. We need to practice. We can read all the procedures and checklists that we like, but you won't really know what's involved until you test it, that you get out on site and start looking for things, trying to see how the liquid moves. I was going to ask a question about how you test your spill procedures. And again, if you've got anything to add to these lists, perhaps pop it into the chat there. So, how do you test your procedures? You may have had actual spills. Don't rely on these as your only source of practice. And if you're having repeated spills, then there's obviously something in your process that you need to deal with there. You might do toolbox talks. You might have training through external training providers in dealing with spills. You can do a walkthrough situation, looking at what can happen, where things can go, what people would actually do. Doing a simulated scenario, either with water, for most substances, it will give you a good idea as to how it will travel on site, or if you've got a gas, that you might use a smoke generator or something similar if needed to get a good simulation of what's happening there. You might do a scenario with an actual substance. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, and depending on your site, you might actually get involved with FENS in doing an exercise with them on site, and they will help you with that, and that can be really useful. One situation I'm aware that did this, the first issue they came across was actually, if 4 appliances turn up, where are they actually going to park? If you've got space for that volume, the size of the response that occurs there. The next question I had there would be, how often do you test? So whether it's something you do annually or 6 monthly, you might do it more often. You might only ever do it when your compliance certifier tells you that your certificate's due and you need to do an emergency response test before they'll issue your certificate. You might do it every couple of years. If you need an emergency response plan under the regulations, hazardous substance regulations, then you need to be testing that at least once a year. And that's not necessarily one big annual test. A lot of sites find it really useful to have perhaps quarterly emergency planning or testing where they look at different scenarios. And obviously if you've got a site with a lot of different types of substances, if you've got gases and flammable liquids and corrosives, then you're going to have different responses to those, and you're going to need to do tests of those different responses. You might also want to mix up the scale of what you're doing. So, one year you might test a small response, and then one year you might test a major one there. One of the reasons for practicing our plan is to get alignment. The other is to engage with different learning styles and to get some muscle memory involved in what you're doing. You can look at a plan that says these are where the spill kits are, these are where the fire extinguishers are, but when you're actually walking around your site and looking for them and trying to find them and seeing what equipment's in them, that's so much more present and valuable for people in learning. What we're wanting to do with our test is find out, does what the plans say align with what people actually do? And we want to make sure that we're involving everyone who could respond with our spill. So not just do it at a higher level health and safety thing and say, the plan will make sense, people will do it. Actually see what people do when you put them in that situation. If our plan doesn't align with what people do, doesn't mean we need to change the plan. Get input from people as to how they will respond. Is there additional information that's needed in that plan just to make it a bit more clear? Do you need to do more training? The plan's great, but people aren't sure about what they need to do. Do you need to have more equipment? It can take a more detailed examination than you might think. There's a lot of questions to ask. You know, how's this going to happen? What are we going to do next? What if this happened? What if we ran out of absorbent? What would we use? Or there's another spill kit. It's got the wrong sort of material for this. Those sorts of questions. How often you do your testing is situation dependent, and your emergency procedures, your spill plans should document how and how often you test your plan. And even if you're looking at the requirements under the General Risk and Workplace Management requirements for an emergency plan, you don't necessarily need one under your hazardous substances. That still includes making sure that you've got provision in there for testing your plan. Always question. You need to channel your inner 3-year-old. So many questions to ask when we're looking at these. What, where, how are we going to get rid of it? How do we get hold of Bob? No, seriously, where's Bob? What if this happens? Who are you actually going to call? Those sorts of questions there. So at this point, this was the end of my presentation. Are there any questions or comments that anyone wants to make at this stage? Well, thank you very much for your time today. As Chrissy said, a recording of the session will be sent out after the presentation. And don't hesitate to contact the team of us at Chem Safety if we can help with this or any other topic that you're dealing with. Thank you.